כן, התחלתי. Hello everyone and welcome to our second session of today. And we are happy to have with us Dr. Nadine Trajtenberg. Nadine has been at IDC for several years. She actually has been the Associate Dean at both the School of Economics and the Harrison School of Business, where she headed the MBA and GMBA programs. And then she went and served as the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Israel. And now she's back with us at the Faculty of Economics, and we are very excited to hear Nadine's take on the global economic consequences of the corona crisis. So Nadine, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Niron, and thank you all of you for taking this Friday afternoon to be with us. Just a few procedural things. I'd rather have the questions at the end of the presentations, but unless you have really something, a really urgent one, then you can raise your hand or you can write down in the chat, and Oded here will help me answer these questions. So let me tell you first what I'd like to do in this short presentation. What I'd like to do is, in order to understand the economic impact of the pandemic, not only how it affects the economy today, I think on that we're reading constantly about what's the immediate impact, but rather how it can fundamentally change the global economic activity and how global economic activity is carried out and what type of impact can that have on future economic growth. First, I will spend some time understanding in what economic conditions this global pandemic is arriving on the stage. In a sense, similarly to corona patients or any patients for that matter, how well you cope with a virus depends very much on your initial condition, your age, your gender, whether you had medical conditions in the back, and so on. Similarly, what is the stage, again, what are the characteristics of our conditions as we are now being hit by this pandemic? There's someone speaking in the back? For some reason, I'm unable to, this is one of the, I'm unable to, oh, okay, there it is, okay. So first, so let me tell you what I will do, and then I will go through it. So first, I want to understand the stage, I mentioned that. I'll spend some time understanding the past decade, which was an unusual one. And that's important to remember. In fact, it was a rather disappointing one in terms of economic growth. And it apparently delivered what economists now call secular stagnation. And I'll spend some time on understanding this. In addition, there were a few unpleasant facts during these disappointing decade that became apparently quite entrenched. And I'll talk about two of them: inequality in wealth and in income, and protectionist policies, which we've seen occurring towards the end of the decade. Then I'll look indeed, how does the COVID-19 is impacting the economy and how it can, and it will continue to impact the economy for a little while. And finally, I want to outline what is needed for renewed, healthy, and sustained economic growth. So let me first turn to the first point I mentioned, which is that this past decade was a very unusual and particularly a disappointing one. So I want to remind you that this decade opened up, of course, with the great financial crisis. You can see here when you look at the graph, and those who have been students of mine have seen this graph in my class. And I always say you're lucky to be students at this time because you get to see a graph that nobody saw, you know, before 2009. They had to go all the way back to the Great Depression in order to see such a big dip in these lines. So the global financial crisis, and you can see, of course, Advanced economies were more affected, but the world economy dropped in terms of GDP, in fact, shrunk for a year. Again, this was an extremely unusual thing to happen. So, and I just want to remind you, what exactly happened then. The two biggest economies in the world went into downward tailspin, if you want, because of a financial crisis. In the US, you remember, it was a real estate bubble that was spun by incentives and financial engineering that brought down some major financial institutions and required policy interventions never seen before in peacetime, particularly by the central bank, by the Fed. So the government deficit ballooned, the central banks did things like QE, they had zero interest rates for 8 years, something truly, truly unusual. In Europe, remember, we used to talk about the pigs: Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Iceland, Greece, Spain. These were all countries that for one reason or another, sometimes similar to the US, sometimes real estate bubbles, sometimes it was government profligacy that led us there, but they also went into tailspins. And the policy response was of massive government intervention, used debts were built. And again, of course, the European Central Bank went into very aggressive mood and even took some steps till this day, that is even before the corona, with interest rates that were negative. So truly a very unusual decade that we went to. But it was a known type of crisis, okay? So let me just say, one of the things and that financial crisis, left a mark for the entire decade. If you look at the pace of growth, and that's true for advanced economies as well as for emerging markets, if you look at the line, you can see here on the graph on the left-hand side, before and after the crisis. In fact, you can see that in advanced economies, the growth of today is much lower than it would have been had it returned to where we were just before. The dotted line was sort of the pace of growth that we had prior to the global financial crisis. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see that in fact what was occurring was that productivity had come down. So we had a certain level of productivity for the financial crisis and then went down following the financial crisis. And that was true for advanced economies as well as for emerging market economies. Now, I said it was a known type of crisis, but it wasn't a textbook case. I mean, it started like a textbook case of a crisis. It's a shock to aggregate demand. In fact, financial markets and money markets dry up, and they're no longer providing the liquidity needed for economic activity to continue at the pace that we knew. So you enter recession, so consumption falls, particularly as wealth shrunk, investment falls as growth prospects fade. And then government sort of wants to, there was a drop in aggregate demand. Remember your textbook. So government has to boost aggregate demand. This is one of the things that we learned since John Maynard Keynes. So they boost aggregate demand by increasing fiscal spending, or in some cases, particularly in the United States, by reducing taxes. And the central bank provides tons of liquidity in order to prop up this aggregate demand. This takes some time to work out. And eventually, unemployment starts to fall, and inflation is supposed to be, to pick back up. But growth sort of returned, unemployment fell, but we didn't see the wage increases that we expected. We didn't see the inflation that we expected. And therefore, the interest rates started staying very low, and investment remained low. So it wasn't our usual textbook case. And about midway in the decade, people started talking about the fact that, well, there were other things going on. And particularly, apparently, we had reached what is called secular stagnation. And let me spend some time on that. So secular stagnation refers to a state where economic growth, and this was true for global growth, is low despite enormous monetary stimulus. So you have low growth, low investment, low inflation, and low interest rates. By the way, low inflation, let me remind you why is to a certain extent a problem. It's not a problem when you have low inflation and you have, fast growth. It becomes a problem when you hit a downturn. And a lot of the discussions lately, in fact, last year, a lot of the discussion is how are we going to cope with the next downturn? One of the typical and extraordinarily powerful tool to cope with a downturn has always had to be to have really negative real interest rate. It's difficult to have negative nominal interest rate. If you have to pay the bank, to put your money there, at some point, the cost is going to be too high. You'll pull your money out and you'll get a warehouse and warehouse your cash somewhere else. That's what negative interest rates mean. On the other hand, if you have fast inflation, then you can more easily have negative interest rates, because even if you have a zero interest rates, but there's inflation in real terms, in fact, you're facing quite negative interest rates. And this has been a tool that has been used massively by all countries for the past 70 years. In fact, a lot of the debt that was incurred, you sort of wipe out the debt by having inflation. You don't want to have too much inflation, because then the economy can also go into a tailspin, but if you want some amount of inflation. Secular stagnation is telling us, so we'll have low growth, low investment, but because of the low inflation and low interest rates, we will lack a tool in order to reignite economic growth. And this was I would say, a very big problem for policymakers, and this is what had been talked about the new normal. How are we going to operate in this new normal? Now, it took a while for people to realize that this is what was occurring. In part, some, particularly at the beginning of the decade, people said, no, this is normal. It was a huge financial crisis. It takes a long time to get out of it. You don't get out of a slump that was caused by a global financial crisis the same way you get out of a slump caused by a usual recession. But as it continued, then people started saying, well, apparently there's other things going on there. If you want, the crisis hid behind. And some of the things that apparently were happening is that demographic changes might be creating too much savings. What do I mean by too much savings? If interest rates are low, and remember interest rates in your class, the money market is what sets, the equilibrium between the amount of savings and the amount of investment needed. If lots of people want to invest and there's not much savers, then the interest rate will rise, and the other way around. So if we have really low interest rates, it could be that there's too much saving or too little investment. Apparently, there's a bit of both. So the changes in demographics, people are having fewer children, they have longer retirement, and therefore they need to save more. Asian countries have huge current account surpluses and are building very large amount of savings. In addition, the rise in inequality made that, remember that people with a higher income save a larger proportion of their income. So perhaps this has become a chronic, if you want, problem that there's too much savings. We also noticed there was apparently very little investment. So some people said, for good reasons, new technologies do not require the same very large amount of financing for huge machinery the way we used to. So perhaps indeed we can do just as well with the new technologies with smaller amount of investment. Others fear that no, apparently there's the amount of uncertainty in the world is such that people don't want to invest so much. In addition, there's slower growth in the labor force, in which case there's a slower growth of investment needed. So all these debates were going on, and we had reached a point where we sort of had taken for granted that apparently this was going to be the new normal. And a few months ago, in fact, the Weekly Economist magazine was always very much on top and up to date as to what's happening in global economic development. And its front cover had this, and you have here a copy of the cover that talk about the world's economy's strange new rules. And the strange new rules are the rules of secular stagnation, which means that monetary policy might be weakened because we're not going to have the possibility to have really strongly negative real interest rate. On the other hand, fiscal policy probably has more space, because if the interest rates are going to be really low, then you can take on more debt because your debt repayment is going to be lower. And the third aspect of this new normal is because interest rates are low, if you want some return on your savings, you're going to be taking higher amounts of risks. So you'll be taking more financial risks. And this, of course, there's a good side to that, but there's always the fear, it always raises the spectrum that, perhaps we're building another set of bubbles in a certain type of assets, perhaps in the real estate market and so on. And perhaps we will, in fact, be creating another financial market, in the making. So this is what was being discussed. In addition, there were other unpleasant facts, and there are more than unpleasant facts, but there were other things happening, which again, you're never quite sure whether it's permanent, whether it's just there for a while. But as time passed, I think that we sort of agreed that it had become a chronic feature of the global economy. And one of them was the deepening inequality. The deepening inequality, and I will not spend too much time on that, but it has had, and we're starting to see the very important consequences of it. And one of the consequences, of course, is massive social and political discontent. And what it has generated, populism, Brexit, the Trump's trade wars, all of these things are not unrelated to the rise in income and particularly in wealth inequality around the world. So protectionism, which had, basically for the past 70 years, we enjoyed reduction of trade barriers and increased globalization. And that's what had allowed many countries, Japan, Korea, China, and many others, to have their economic growth completely export-led. Suddenly the specter, as we reached, the end of the decade, rose fairly dramatically. And here I want to show you that the protectionist politics had already started, before the coronavirus appeared. If you look at world trade, in fact, it had been shrinking already for a year before the pandemic occurred. So that's the wobbly world stage upon which now the COVID-19 is setting up. So what does it mean? Okay, so again, we were talking here about an enormous shock, not by the virus itself, but of course by the measures taken to contain the virus. We've seen this, it has a massive impact on our ability to produce, to trade, a supply shock. So not a demand shock, as I was talking before. In fact, there's been very few large global supply shocks. We know how, the supply shock impacts are typically associated with natural disasters, an earthquake here, a tsunami there, fires, wars, certainly in Israel, we've seen things like that. It only typically affects a certain part of the world and sometimes a certain part of a country. So there are very few large global supply shock. I can think of only one in the past 70 years. And that was in 1973, the oil shock. The oil shock, remember, the OPEC countries got together and raised dramatically the price of oil. So that became a global supply shock because all countries, of course, were using oil as energy. And that created a decade of very low growth, very low productivity, inflation, and in some countries, when it was mismanaged, hyperinflation. And Israel was one of those countries, of course. So when we look at the supply shock, so this is very unusual to see a large global supply shock. Not only that, it is of an order of magnitude never seen before, but truly never seen before. You can see this by, I added here the IMF forecast. On the left-hand side, you can see the drop in GDP expected in the US, which is about 6%. You can see in Israel, and this is the GDP growth, annual GDP growth of Israel since 1952. And this is a negative shock of about 6%. If you put it in per capita term, it's a negative shock of 8%. Truly something unseen. By the way, to have a negative shock of that size of 6%, and look in the series, you have almost nowhere a negative shock of that amount. Not the 73 Yom Kippur War, not the 67 Great Recession, and so on and so forth. And certainly, the Intifada, the very long Intifada, the Lebanese War, the second Lebanese War, none of them came anywhere close to the type of shock. In order to have this 6-8% drop, annual drop, it means that during the time, okay, because it's not the entire year, during the time where these measures are in effect, you're talking about a drop in economic activity of about 25 to 30%. Again, this is absolutely massive. It's happening not just in one country because of a tsunami or earthquake, it's happening everywhere. Of course, and perhaps strangely, it's not only a supply shock, but it's also a demand shock, because the measures taken are also limiting our ability to consume. We can't go out, we can't go to restaurants, we can't travel, so our consumption or investment has dropped. If you look at the Bank of Israel's data that they just published last week, you can see these are credit card purchases. On average, credit card purchases dropped by about 40%. It's the dark line. And you can see some of our expenses clearly in tourism or gas and so on. These things have dropped even more. The only thing apparently that we're still buying is food. You can see there was an increase of 30% as well in pharmacy spending. But on average, our spending has also dropped by 40%. So it's both a supply, and this is occurring, of course, everywhere. So it's both a supply, a massive supply shock, but it's also a demand shock as well. How easily can we rebound from this type of shock? Well, there's some things that will pull us down a little bit, okay? And not just a little bit. Remember that the shock occurred in part sequentially, so that when we get ready to start consuming, to buy, to sell, to our, to export, not clear that the buyers of our products, on the other hand, will be just as ready as we are. So this will be a sequential, because of the sequence, then again, rebuilding the supply chain will take a little longer. And remember that our supply chains have become increasingly complex over the past 2 decades. So there's more and more, countries involved in that, how they're handling the crisis, at which point are they reopening, to what extent are they doing this? So rebuilding the supply chain will take a little while, so we're not going to be able to bounce back as quickly. To give you an example, in 2006, when we had the Lebanese war here in Israel, remember, it fell in the 3rd quarter, it was in the summer, it was 6 weeks, there was a clear beginning, there was a clear end, there was a massive drop in GDP during that quarter of about 6 to 8% again. But then we bounced back immediately in the following quarter, in part compensating. It was short, it was clean, and we were the only ones in the world suffering this shock. So it was easily to bounce back. Again, rebuilding the supply chain will take a while. And here you can have a sense here by looking at an electric bike, the number of parts and the different places it comes from. So that gives us a sense of what needs to be rebuilt. In addition, there's also lingering uncertainty, not only with respect to the coronavirus itself, is it going to come back next year, not going to come back? It's also raising the specter of other global disasters. We sort of put aside, climate change, but I think this virus is also bringing back up this possibility that, if there's other global disasters, then we need not just to rebuild the old supply chains, but we probably need to restructure them. So perhaps we'll have more production at home. There will also be political arguments for achieving national sufficiency in certain products. Perhaps we'll keep larger inventories than before. So it's a bit like paying an insurance. It's costly. It translates into less efficiency, higher costs. That's what it means. In addition, sometimes there's a mismatch between production and distribution networks. We've seen this, by the way, particularly in the supply chain of food. In the US, it's been very, very obvious where they, in fact, in many countries where they have to destroy food because they don't have the distribution network that they used to have before. The rebound will also be constrained by the fact that, our capital has not been destroyed, but part of our labor is being hurt. I mean, economists, and particularly labor economists, are very much aware that unemployment, and particularly if it's long unemployment, but even when it's not very long unemployment, it makes a huge difference whether you're unemployed in an upturn or in a downturn. And if you're reaching the job market on a downturn, chances are that your entire path, not only for decades, but sometimes for a lifetime, your patch of wage growth will be lower than it would have been had you entered the job market or had you been unemployed and re-entered the job market a few years before that. So there's no destruction of physical capital in a pandemic, but the damage to human capital can be quite significant. And in addition, in order to cope with the immediate impact, of course, of the pandemic, governments, individuals, and so on have taken on lots of debt. If you take on lots of debt, imagine that you took on a second mortgage in order to weather the few months of leave without pay or your unemployment period. Then afterwards, when you go back, your consumption is going to be reduced because you have to reduce the amount of debt. So this was very much at play following the global financial crisis. And here we're talking about a huge amount of debt to be taken, particularly, of course, by governments, but also by corporations and by individuals. All of these things will pull us down. This is a pretty depressing picture I'm painting. So I want to leave you with the other side, because there's, as always, there's another side. So let me go from dislocation to creative destruction. So I want to try to think about it, not just in terms of what's happening this year, what will the global economy look like over the next 1, 2, 3 years. I want to look a little bit further down the line. I want to look 5, 10 years down the line. And we know, of course, since the Industrial Revolution, that economic growth is first and foremost led by technological change. And we've all noticed that there was a growing, contradiction between the amount of innovations, the new technologies that we've seen in the past 10 years. And remember the figures I showed you about productivity. How it be that at the same time we have all these new technologies coming to market and being used, and at the same time the overall productivity and growth path has dropped? This contradiction at some point has to be resolved. In many countries, and in Israel is, by the way, is an extreme case of this, of having two economies. We have one economy which is technologically advanced, it's efficient, it's agile, people earn high wages. And then we have the traditional economy, which is inefficient, it's facing and frustrated by bureaucracy. It has a poorly paid workforce. So we have these two things, working at the same time. Now, by the way, this is an interesting graph, which again, the students in my class will have seen before, but let me tell you a little bit about what we see here. If we think of, GDP growth, and here we have GDP growth for a whole bunch of the OECD countries for the previous 25 years, you can decompose it as, are they growing because labor is growing fast, or are they growing because they're adding more capital? Or are they growing because of something we don't quite know what it is, multi-factor productivity, which is often associated with technological change, but also in doing things in a better way. Note that total factor productivity growth, which captures this unknown, has been the highest in Korea, also in Ireland very high, but has been the highest for Korea over that period. And then if you look at countries like Spain and Italy, they've had negative total factor productivity growth, which is give them the same amount of factors and they do worse than they used to do. So they have been unlearning to a certain extent. And when you think of Spain, Italy, and Korea, this nicely correlates with how well or how badly these countries have coped with the coronavirus. So this dislocation, this massive shock that the COVID-19 has brought about, and the measures taken have also given us an unprecedented experiment in reorganizing how we do things. And I say unprecedented because it hit almost everyone, everywhere around the globe. So how do we work remotely? How do we teach? How do we learn? How do we shop? How do we govern? Okay. How do we use data for optimizing, particularly governance? Okay, we've seen this in Korea, how they've handled the coronavirus, and so on. So from this incredible experiment, we'll be able to gather how we should be operating in a more efficient way, if you want, truly integrating these new technologies in how we go about doing things. And by the way, the stock market noticed, a lot of people have been wondering, how come the stock market is not falling further, given the size, this incredible size of the shock? But if you notice, it hasn't done it completely blindly. And certainly the stocks of the companies that are due to benefit from this reorganizations have produced remarkably better than the average. So if you look on the left-hand side, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Facebook, they've all seen, they've all outperformed dramatically above the S&P. They're a big weight in the S&P. Just by itself, they pulled up the stock market. So the stock market has risen, yes, but in part because of very specific stock. Now, this is the question you'll have. Now, how can we make the switch? And this is what the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter talked about when he talked about creative destruction. And creative destructions means that newcomers will be displacing old timers. How well will we be able to do that? They're both winners and losers when we do something like that. Will the political institutions allow for this? Remember, they're entrenched elites who want to protect their turf. Do the entrenched elite have more political power on the country's institutions? Is innovation encouraged? Will the government know how to govern differently? Now, those who will be able to do that, and we've already get a sense of which countries are doing that, will probably be able to embark, in fact, on a new decade of faster growth than what we've seen, in fact, in the past 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadine. So there were a few questions in the chat that I will spell out for you, and then we can open it up. So one student with the unforgettable name Avi Bitter Lemon asks, this supply and demand shock that you are describing, how will it look like in Israel in the short term and long term?
Well, in fact, when you look at the OECD, also made, and the economy is not very different. The type of shock, we're reacting pretty much in the same way as most OECD countries. So the drop expected in economic activity, which we're feeling right now, as I mentioned, is an order of magnitude of between 25 to 30%, similar to other countries. It means unemployment. The pickup will probably be slow because of all the things that I've mentioned. And I must say that in Israel, the government response has been slow. I mean, the fiscal side has been slow and quite inappropriate and weak. So that will probably weigh down on us a little bit more in the year to come, okay? On the other hand, Israel has more fiscal space than most other countries. So we can take on more debt, or we're unlikely to suffer from taking on more debt because we start with a GDP, with a debt to GDP relatively low compared to others.
Okay, then there was a question, how does the drop in oil prices interact with all this corona crisis?
I mean, in a sense, remember that if you have a supply shock, you expect prices to increase. If you have demand shock, you expect prices to fall. So what we're seeing in the oil prices was that the demand shock for that industry, there was also supply shock because of the fight between Saudi Arabia and Russia and so on. So there they had the oil shock, the reduction in the oil, the end result, which is the fall in the oil prices, is a for the world economy. I mean, it is like a positive supply shock. On the other hand, we're unlikely to be able to use it very much, certainly not in the short term. Remember that one of the biggest consumers of oil in the world is the airline industry. And the airline industry is likely to suffer not just during this period, but even when they remove most of the measures. I think it will take a while before the airline industry goes back to where it was before.
Okay, and one last question, then we can open it up to others. There is a question here whether Sweden, which took a very different strategy towards treating the corona, do you think the economic situation or crisis will be different there?
Well, they've also had, if you look at the impact on Sweden, it's not that much less. It's true they had, they had apparently a very different approach. In practice, less so. When you tell the Swedes to keep their distance, it's something pretty natural for Swedes. So they keep their distance. You don't need to force it. So yes, you keep the coffee shops open, but people don't go very much to the coffee shops, okay? And they did close down the schools as well. So in fact, Sweden is expected also to see a drop in its economic activity, less than Israel, in part because of the composition, by the way, of its production, but it's also expected to suffer from it. I mean, if you look, it's always slightly dangerous to compare different countries. Sweden is not a very dense country, and areas that have tended to be most affected are areas that are dense. So it was in dense cities as well that you found the biggest damage. And Israel is one of the densest countries in the world. So not surprisingly, the measures taken were perhaps a little bit more extreme, and therefore the economic impact more felt significantly.
Okay, and we also are broadcasting this live in Facebook, and I see that there is a question from our Facebook listeners or watchers that are asking whether with regard to the stock market, Do you think that it actually illustrates a true picture of the crisis at this point? Does it see something that we don't? I think you reflected on it, but maybe you have anything else to say. And do you think that the stock market understands that governments are going to bail out the economy and boost markets?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's always very, very dangerous to be a pundit on the stock market. But so I'll give a few things in perspective. One, the stock market drop. Again, I'm comparing it to the global financial crisis because, you know, it's the last instance of a very big shock. If you look at the behavior of the stock market during the last crisis, there was an initial hit, about a 30% drop, then it rose again, and then the drop, you know, from peak to trough by about 50 to 55%. But this second drop was protracted, and it took almost a year for the rest of the drop to occur. So from peak to trough, it was a drop of 50 to 55%, but it took a long time to occur. So something like that might also be at play. There was an immediate shock, there was a rebound, you know, the prices are still fairly high. So we could see, you know, a further sort of, you know, protracted reduction. Clearly it's being propped up by a lot of liquidity in the US, the ECB, other central banks around the world. It was also the case last time. So this massive liquidity gives it, if you want, a floor. And again, the composition of who's gaining and who's losing within the stock market has been quite different, as I mentioned in my talk.
Okay, so let's open it up. I see that Iftach had the question. Iftach, are you with us?
Yes, I'm here. I would like to ask, there is two kinds of people in general, people who can work from home and people who cannot. And usually there is an education discrepancy between these two groups in the general sense that the people who can work from home is usually more educated. Do you see this gap growing or the effect, how would it affect inequality in the long term?
I agree. I mean, almost the people who were most affected, I mean, there were also other people affected, but a lot of people who were affected greatly are also those people who were already at the lower end of the economic spectrum. So this would tend to intensify even more inequality. So I want to go back to the very end of my lecture when I say that we ought to be doing things differently. And certainly one of the things that we ought to do is to tackle inequality, this in itself having been a drag on economic activity, by the way. Now, if you do that, and if you do that well, by the way, clearly that means educating them more, giving tools so that they will, then you will have a switch, meaning by that the very highly paid, highly skilled people will now be competing, you know, there'll be more people over there. So the wages of those will come down. And the other thing is that a lot of the essential services, and we saw this during this period, a lot of the essential services, if they're essential, then we should be willing to pay more for it. So if we move more people out of there, you know, more skilled, so the average wages, if you want, of the better off should come down. But then this will mean that the average wage of those providing services that require less skill should also rise. But we have to do things well. Otherwise, indeed, the inequality gap might just increase even more.
Thank you. Shuval Cohen, you had a question?
Yeah. Hi, Nadine. How the aid package that's given by the Fed, the 2.2 trillion, will affect the inflation rate in the US? Because they just inject a lot of money into the ecosystem, like printing money. So
yeah, completely. That's the $1 million question. Remember that, and remember that we have both a supply and a demand shock. So if you have a supply shock, I said you should see inflation rise. Certainly if you push the demand. That's what happened in 1973. In 1973, when there was the oil shock, and government seeing that tried to prop up to prop up demand, also by increasing money supply. And that created inflation, and in some cases, hyperinflation. Are we going to see this time around? During the last global financial crisis, there was a lot of liquidity injected, and people said, wow, you know, this will bring inflation. And a decade later, we realized not at all, no inflation at all created. So where are we this time around? Are we more like in 73 and there's a danger for inflation? Or are we more like 11 years ago, and in fact, we can use all of that to prop up aggregate demand and still no inflation will rise? I mean, I'm debating with myself as to what we will be seeing inflation-wise. And I must say, I haven't come yet to a conclusion to which, you know, where it will fall. There is a danger for that, but I'm not sure that we're going to be there in the very near future.
Neil Gilbert, I'm sorry, I missed your question. Would you like to ask your question? Neil?
Yes. Question about your previous job. Maybe if you were in your previous position, what would you recommend the government to do in those days?
There's the government and then there's central bank. I mean, the Bank of Israel has reacted pretty much the way many other central banks around the world have reacted. And I think that they've, roughly, I think they hit it right in terms of, you know, when we had a fast, I mean, they basically did two things. One is that they make sure that they would be providing liquidity for the financial sector. They've also, in the supervisor of the banks, they've also allowed, as in many other places, I mean, this has become a standard tool, was to allow, in fact, you know, financial institutions to have less capital, you know, not to, if you want to forgive them if they allow the repayment of the loans they give to be postponed and all sorts of things like that. And in addition, we saw also the Bank of Israel providing swap lines of $15 billion. That's exactly what they should have done. And I think they've hit it pretty well. What has not been done well, I think, has been fiscal response. I think, and particularly the fiscal response has been slow in its implementation. It's been very foggy, and it has been completely, I would say, with a complete disregard of a very large chunk of the economy. With respect to small businesses, you know, if you look at the private sector in Israel, small businesses, and I'm talking about businesses that have less than 9 people, they account for 47% of the output, the private sector. So it's a big chunk of the economy. They also account for about 46% or 48% of employment in the private sector. The help to the small businesses has been slow to come, cumbersome, or not there at all. So that, I think, has been very bad, and it will weigh on us because in the makeup, and in addition, there was no specific thought given to the sectors that were hit massively. Okay, so certainly the airline sector, transportation, tourism, hotels. I mean, think about, for instance, a city like Eilat. I mean, clearly you have to think of Eilat differently than any other city in Israel. Okay, it's a city which is its entire economy is based on the things that you can't do now. So, you know, you have to think differently as to what to do. So I think the response has been very poor.
Thank you, Nadine. Gal Ginsburg, you had a question?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Nadine. So my question is, what's your take on the way that the Trump administration dealt with the crisis, and how do you think it will impact the U.S. economy?
How will it affect the U.S. economy?
Yes.
Is that the question? Sorry. Okay. So first, I mean, we're seeing, I mean, in the U.S. there's, so again, the Fed had, you know, massive intervention. There were some quick moves but the implementation apparently has not been, in a sense, I mean, you could think of that. I mean, the unemployment offices were completely overwhelmed. I mean, it's not, you know, that's not surprising. What I fear for what is, you know, when I think of what might weigh the economy down mostly, I think that what it might, and you know, what's the potential with a quick rebound? I think it has a few things going against itself. One of them, it already started with a high level of debt and it's taking on a lot more. Two, unemployment is absolutely massive and inequality was already very high. And again, those being hit are those at the lower level of the so. Now, this in itself is going to bring about probably more protectionist policy, which in itself is not good for the economy, not only for the global economy, but for the US economy. So all of these trends, I think, are dangerous for its potential pickup afterwards. So that's what I'm afraid of in the US.
Thank you. Yoram Davidi?
Yes. Hello. I'd like to know, because you talked about total factor productivity and about how different countries use creative destruction or maybe creative reconstruction. And I wanted to know if you think that there are countries that already started thinking in this method or already started applying new thinking or new restructuring.
I mean, in general, if you look at China, and it's of course it's a very different political institutions, very different country, but both Korea and which is closer to what we know as a country, but China, these are countries that are allowing ways to do business in a very different way than they used to be. Think for instance of, you know, the financial sector and the financial innovation, the massive financial innovations that we've seen, you know, with Tencent, Ant Financial and Alipay. I mean, these things are basically telling the incumbent, sorry, this is not the way we're doing things anymore. And if you think of G5, okay, China is the only country in the world now that is, you know, embarking. And with G5, they will be able to reinvent entirely the way they live, the way they operate. And there's nobody else for the moment who is coming close to that. So if there is one country that looks like it's going to continue on this path of creative destruction, I think it's China.
Thank you. Dan Baranes?
היי, כן, שלום.
היי.
היי. לא, האמת היא הייתה לי שאלה שהייתה קשורה למה שאמרת קודם.
Thank you, Dan. So we had another question from our Facebook audience asking if you think that it is likely to experience another economic drop, realizing the higher damages that actually happened to the economy.
I'm not sure. Can you?
I'm not sure that I understand.
Run this again? I'm not sure I understand the question either.
Do you think it is likely to experience another economic drop, layoff, stock drop, unpaid debt, etc., realizing the higher damages to the economy and slower recovery than expected? So I think, again, this boils down to the V versus L or whatever, I think.
Yeah. No, okay. I think the pickup I mentioned, I think the pickup will be longer than expected.
I think we covered that.
So I said, you know, the pickup, I mean, you know, if I'm looking a year, 2 years ahead, this will be slow and sluggish, but that's not to say that 5 years down the road, we might not have learned something and be able, in fact, to embark on higher growth.
All right. Dana, you had a question?
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask, about the government policy of giving manakim and loans to big employers in the Israeli economy, like Fox, Arhel Wiesel, and other big players. So I would like to hear.
Again, I think I think again the design of the fiscal response has been wrong almost everywhere. I mean, it's not that you shouldn't, these are big employers, so it's not that you should not, support big employers, and different countries have done it differently. But why to specially do something for big employers? I mentioned again, I want to go back, small enterprises, those that have less than 9 employees, okay, account for 47% of the output in the private sector, okay? And those are forgotten.
Thank you. Kovi?
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering, as far as I'm aware, there's a very high consumption level or very little saving amongst Israelis, like a lot of Israelis living in Minos. Do you think that this could be exactly the kind of shock that people need to kind of stop spending disposable income in the same way?
I mean, it's true that we use this term that we all live in minus, but the truth is that the savings rate in Israel is relatively high. Remember, we have forced savings. We have no choice. For those who are employees, there's almost 20% of our wage goes in retirement saving. So the overall savings is relatively high. The overall debt of households is not very high compared to other countries. So in principle, we should be able, and certainly if the interest rate stays low, and if the financial system, the banking and the non-bank, can continue to provide, is willing to take the risks to provide loans at a cheap price, then I think individuals in Israel could continue not to suffer too much. But by the way, I want to say one thing about the risk. The type of risk we're talking about, because the risk is not just how long this bout of pandemic will last, but there might be another bout. And this is an enormous amount of risk. In a sense, the private sector is unable, to take on that risk. And that's why everywhere you need the government to step in. The only one who can take on that risk is someone like the government. So it's a central bank by, by purchasing bonds and other assets, and thus reducing the interest rates. Only the government can raise 100-year bonds, right, at a reasonably rate, and so on. So that's why the government should step in and, in a sense, take the risk, that type of risk, out of the market. The market, neither individuals nor private companies can take on a risk of that size.
So we're reaching almost the end, actually we are about beyond the end of this meeting. I will let just Juliana ask one last question, and then unfortunately—
Last question.
Juliana. Juliana?
Okay, hello.
Juliana?
Yes, could you listen to me?
Yeah.
So I wanted to know, some countries have been liberating the pension funds approximately 25%. Do you think this is a good solution? If so, it will be a problem in the long term?
It can be a problem in the long term, but I would tend to think that in the short term, it's not a bad thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is a big hit that we have to go through. And if you have long-term retirement savings, you can have access to it, it's not a bad thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay,
we'll deal with the
much,
long-term
Nadine.
Retirement when we get there.
Thank you very much, Nadine. It has been fascinating, really a cool view of the global economic situation and the effect of the corona right now on it, and also for the future. So thank you again. And Yonat, do we wish to say a few more words to the class?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nadine. Before we conclude with the class and—
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, okay, I wanted to thank you.